I've been a large animal vet for 38 years. Horses, cattle, bison, the odd draft mule that had taken a fence rail across the chest and was breathing badly and needed someone willing to crawl into its stall at 2 in the morning without being asked twice. I spent 16 years in a mixed practice clinic in the Northern Hill Country, another 9 as a contract vet for the Territorial Survey Commission, out on the frontier margins where the settlement roads ended and the old grazing lands began. I've stitched wounds that would have made a surgeon retire. I've set bones that had no good reason to heal but healed anyway. I have made my peace with blood and with the peculiar smell that infection makes in an enclosed space, and I have learned that most animals, even the ones that arrive at you terrified or enraged, will accept your hands if you move slowly enough and mean what you're doing. I am not a brave man. I want to be clear about that before I tell you the rest of this. I am a 66-year-old man with a bad left knee, a hearing aid in my right ear, and a professional stubbornness that my wife called a character flaw for 31 years, and then seemed to regard as a kind of virtue in the last stand few. She died in the spring, 3 years before any of this happened. I took the commission contract at the Corthon Reachfield station, partly because the pay was reasonable, and partly because I needed somewhere to be that required all of me, every hour of it, and left no room for the other thing. The field station was decommissioned. That was the word in the assignment brief. Decommissioned field veterinary post, seasonal rotation, large and extra-large fauna assessment, boundary line monitoring. The Corton Contested Reach was a strip of high frontier territory, where the settlement boundary and the Old Dragon territory had been technically in negotiation for 60 years without resolution. There were protocols. You did not pursue anything into the deep reach. You noted signs of activity in the log. You did not provoke. The Commission's position was that the contested territories were best managed through studied non-engagement, which in practice meant that my contract asked me to assess, log, not escalate, and come in from the perimeter by dark. I arrived in late summer with a field kit, a satellite uplink unit that worked about 60% of the time, a folding cot, and a 6-month supply of what the Commission called provisions, and what I called the reason. A man stocks his own food alongside the official rations. The station itself was a low rectangular building of prefabricated composite panels, solar array on the south face, a water reclamation tank, and 3 large holding bays on the east side that had once been used for injured frontier stock. The holding bays had not been occupied in 4 years. I cleaned them anyway. It is a habit. Empty bays need cleaning the same as full ones, maybe more so, because once they fill you do not always have the time. The reach itself was something, I will say that. I had been on frontier postings before, but the high ground here ran in long ridges that caught the morning light at an angle that made the stone look almost warm, and in the evenings the far ridgeline went a color that I do not have an exact word for. Not gold, not amber, something between the two, with a faint edge of violet where the sky met it. I ate my dinner on the station's south step most evenings for the first 6 weeks, watching that color happen. It was something my wife would have wanted me to tell her about. I told it to the log instead. That is perhaps not the same, but it kept me honest about what I was seeing. The first 10 weeks were quiet. I logged 3 large raptors with what I suspected were lead shot injuries from some earlier season, treated what I could reach, documented the rest. I found signs of a wolf pack denning in the northeast corner of the boundary strip, and noted it without disturbing them. I replaced a section of the water line that had cracked over the previous winter. The satellite uplink worked 40% of the time. I filed my reports when it cooperated and filed duplicates when it came back online after a gap. I kept regular hours. I slept adequately. I did not think too much, which had been the purpose. On the 43rd day of my posting, something came down on the east perimeter just before first light. I heard it as a series of impacts, heavy and irregular, like something very large losing the argument with the ground in stages. I was already awake. The knee had been bad in the night, and I was at the station window with my field glasses before the sound had fully registered. The eastern ridge was still in shadow. I could not make out much. I put on my boots and my jacket, and I took my field kit out of habit, not because I had decided anything yet, and I walked to the east perimeter fence. What I found was a dragon. I had seen dragons at distance before. Anyone who works the frontier margins long enough will. There was a protocol for that too, and it amounted to: observe, do not approach. Retreat slowly if approached. Log the sighting with coordinates and estimated size. I had followed that protocol twice in 9 years of frontier work and had no quarrel with it. This was not a distant sighting. He was perhaps 40 meters long from the tip of his snout to the base of his tail. I estimated later, because in that moment I was not measuring anything in a systematic way. His scales were a deep weathered blue-gray, the color of old slate after rain, and where the morning light caught the edges of them they held a faint iridescent quality, like oil on still water, barely visible. His wings were enormous, or one of them was. The right wing was folded partially back, pressed against the long ridge of his body, in a way that was not natural. The left wing was wrong. It hung at an angle that no wing should hang at, the leading edge fractured. I could see the misalignment from 15 meters, and the membrane torn along the lower third in a long diagonal gash that was dark with dried matter. He had dragged himself here. I could see the trail of it in the early light. A long, disturbed scrape through the scrubland east of the fence, 20 meters of it, maybe more, where something of immense weight had been pulling itself forward on its forelimbs. He had reached the fence and stopped. He was breathing. Each breath was a deliberate, labored thing, the great chest expanding and then releasing with a sound like slow wind through a cracked timber wall. He was watching me. His eyes were open. They were a pale amber gold, the color of good honey held up to a lamp, and the pupils were narrowed to near slits in the early light. He was watching me the way a badly hurt animal watches the first thing it sees when it stops moving, not with anger yet, not with anything definite, but with a total and exhausted attention that said, "I see you. I am deciding about you." I stood still. The protocol said, retreat slowly, log the sighting, contact the commission uplink, and file the appropriate form. Do not approach. The protocol was written by people who had not stood 15 meters from a creature of this size, in this condition, watching them with those eyes, and who had not been, for the better part of 40 years, the kind of person who retreats when there is something in front of them that is bleeding and breathing badly and waiting to see what you will do. I set my field kit down. I crouched. Not all the way to the ground. The knee would not permit it without noise, but low enough that I was below his eye line, which is the thing you do when you want to say, "I am not threat height. I am smaller than you. I know it, and I want you to know I know it." I stayed like that for a while. He kept breathing. His gaze did not leave me. After several minutes, I opened the kit and I took out a pair of nitrile gloves and I put them on, slowly, one at a time. It is a ritual, the gloves, in the way that all repetitive professional gestures become ritual. I have put on gloves before 1,000 difficult procedures, and the act of it has always been the moment when I stop thinking about what might happen and start thinking only about what needs to happen next. It worked the same way here, I said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I don't know if you understand that, but I'm going to tell you anyway." He did not react in any particular way. The breathing continued. The eyes stayed on me. "That wing is fractured," I said, as though explaining to a colleague. "The membrane tear is significant, but it's not the primary problem. You've lost blood. You're dehydrated, I'd guess, and you've been moving on that injury for, given the state of the wound margin, I would say somewhere between 18 and 24 hours, maybe more." A long pause from him. The great chest rose and fell. "I am going to need to get closer," I said. "If that is not acceptable, you should do whatever you need to do. I understand. But I am going to try. I will not pretend that this was purely rational. I am not sure what it was. I am a man who has spent his professional life in the company of injured animals, and there is a way that the work gets into you into the part of you that operates before the thinking part catches up. And by the time the thinking part arrives, you are already past the fence, and already crouching 6 meters from the damaged left wing, and already running your eyes over the fracture line in the leading edge bone, which I could see now was a compound fracture. The bone displaced laterally by about 4 centimeters, with what appeared to be a secondary stress fracture running back toward the first major joint. He did not move. He watched me. His breath came and went. I said, "This is going to take a while." I went back to the station for supplies. I went back 3 times that first day. I brought the field medical cases, both of them, and the emergency splinting materials I kept in the bay supply cabinet, and 4 20-liter containers of water that I loaded onto the handcart and wheeled to the perimeter, because a creature of his size had fluid requirements that I was going to have to estimate from first principles, given that large animal veterinary techs do not cover this particular patient profile. The wing work was the most technically demanding thing I had done in decades. The compound fracture needed reduction. The displaced bone had to be brought back into reasonable alignment, or healing, if healing was even going to happen, would occur in a position that would never permit functional flight. He was going to have to let me do that, which meant he was going to have to remain still while I applied traction to a bone in a wing that spanned, fully extended, close to 30 meters. I explained what I needed to do before I did it. I do this with all patients. It does not matter whether they can understand the words. The tone of the voice matters. The pace of the explanation matters. You are telling them, "This is coming. I am telling you it is coming. I will not surprise you. I am inside the procedure now, and you can be inside it with me." He let me do it. I will not minimize that. He was in pain. I could see it in the tension that ran through his entire body, the way his foreleg claws pressed into the ground and the earth deformed under them. But he held still. He held still for 40 minutes while I worked the fracture into a manageable position and applied the splinting rig I built from the bay materials, and 3 lengths of reinforced composite strut I stripped from an interior wall section in the station that I decided I could do without. The splint was not elegant. It was the roughest piece of veterinary engineering I have produced in 38 years of practice, but it held the bone aligned, and alignment was what mattered. I cleaned the membrane tear as best I could and applied what I had for infection management, which was a field-grade broad-spectrum paste that was developed for equine membrane injuries, and which I had precisely 0 evidence would be appropriate here, but which I judged better than nothing given the visible contamination in the wound channel. I gave him water. All 4 of the containers gradually over the remainder of that first day, delivered via the stock watering trough I dragged out of the north holding bay. He accepted it. He drank with a restraint that suggested he understood, or that he was simply too exhausted to do otherwise, and I did not know which, and it did not much matter. By late afternoon, I had done everything the first day would allow. I walked back to the station. I made a note in the log: large draconic individual, compound wing fracture, membrane tear, dehydration, moderate blood loss, self-presenting, receiving emergency support. Commission notification pending uplink function. I ate something. I sat on the south step until the ridgeline went that amber-violet color. I went inside and slept. In the morning, he was still there. This is the part that I think about when I think about those weeks now. The first morning, I went out to the perimeter and found him still there. I had half expected something else, that he would be gone, or that something in the night would have changed the situation in ways I had not prepared for. But he was there, still watching the station, still breathing with that careful, deliberate labor. I brought more water. I brought what I had in the way of concentrated food stock that I thought might be relevant. I had no idea what he needed, and so I brought what there was. 3 crates of high-density protein ration that the commission stocked in the bay supplies for large fauna emergencies, which was developed for frontier cattle, but was at least calorie-dense. He inspected it and consumed most of it, which I took as a reasonable sign. I checked the splint. The alignment had held. I did not name him. That is a thing I should say clearly. Because in stories about animals and the people who tend them, the naming is usually presented as the moment of connection, the symbolic crossing from professional distance to something else. I did not name him. He had a name already, presumably, and it was not mine to assign. I thought of him as the patient, which is what I think of all of them while the work is active, because it keeps the focus where it belongs. What I will say is that on the fourth day he moved, not away, toward. He shifted his weight forward on his forelimbs by about 2 meters, closing the distance between us, while I was checking the membrane wound, and when I looked up he had oriented himself so that his head was perhaps 3 meters from where I was crouching. He looked at me steadily. His breath came over me in a slow, warm draft, faintly mineral like stone in the afternoon sun. I went back to work. We found a rhythm. The work imposed it, as work usually does. I came out in the early morning and checked the splint and the wound margins and gave him water. I came again in the middle of the day with food stock and to change the dressing on the membrane tier. I came in the late afternoon to check his temperature, approximated, not measured, because I was working from observation and touch, and to sit near him for a while before the light went. He did not speak. I did not know, in those first weeks, whether he was capable of it in a way I would be able to hear or understand. He communicated in other ways. The orientation of his head, the tension or ease in his body, the quality of his attention when I approached versus when I moved away. He was not difficult. He was the most cooperative patient of any size I have ever treated. There is a quality of stillness in a creature that has decided to trust you that is unlike any other kind of stillness. And by the second week, I would have said without hesitation that this was what he had done. On the 14th day, the uplink came back online for 2 hours, and I filed my commission report. I described the patient, the injuries, the treatment, and the current status. I requested veterinary resupply. I noted that the situation was stable and that I assessed the risk level as low. I did not elaborate. The commission's regional office sent back an automated acknowledgement and a note that resupply would be addressed in the next rotation, which was 6 weeks out. I made do, what making do looked like in practice. I extended the membrane paste by diluting it slightly and increasing application frequency, which was not ideal but maintained coverage. I fashioned a secondary support brace from materials in the bay storeroom, old fence bracket hardware, and lengths of reinforced webbing from the stock supply, and added it to the splint assembly at the main joint, where I had started to see signs of the kind of lateral movement that tells you the primary structure is being tested. I recalibrated the feeding schedule after the first resupply delay, rationing the commission's large fauna stock more carefully and supplementing it with what I could source from the quarterly freight box that came with the uplink resupply, high-density compressed feed blocks intended for draft animals, which were not appropriate for his dietary needs in any specific sense I could document, but which were dense in the way that a patient who is not eating enough needs dense. He ate what I brought every day without fail. I found over the weeks that I could gauge the quality of his recovery not precisely by the measurements I was able to take, which were limited for obvious reasons, but by the way he received the morning's delivery. The first week, consumption was steady but mechanical, the eating of a creature that has accepted the necessity of intake without any pleasure in it. The second week, he began to differentiate. Certain blocks he ate first, others he set aside and returned to, which told me something about preference and also about the gradual re-engagement of an appetite that is beginning to believe it has a future. I noted this in the log without comment. It was a clinical indicator, not a sentiment, but it was the kind of clinical indicator that is also, if you have been doing this long enough, a small and reliable kind of relief. The first 2 weeks, he accepted everything with the same exhausted passivity, a creature that had surrendered to whatever the situation was and was waiting to see how it resolved. In the third week, something changed in the receiving of it. He was present in a different way. Not passive, not merely waiting. He watched me come across the perimeter with the cart, and he was. Attentive is the word. The specific kind of attentive that is not just observation, but engagement. The way a patient looks when they have moved from enduring a thing to participating in it. I noticed it. I did not say anything about it, because that is not what you do. You do not call attention to the patient's progress in a way that introduces pressure into it. But I noticed. On the 21st day, he let me check the full length of the fracture line by touch, which required me to work the entire span of the leading edge, from the point of injury outward in both directions, with him holding the wing in an intermediate position that required sustained effort on his part. He held it for 20 minutes without prompting. When I finished, I said, "Good. That's very good." And he made a sound, the first sound he had made, that was not breath or the involuntary tension response to a painful manipulation. A low, brief, settled sound like a word in a language I had not yet learned the grammar of. The compound fracture was healing, slower than I would have wanted, but cleanly. The alignment had held, which was the thing, and by the third week I could see new tissue bridging the fracture line in the way that bone does when it has been given the conditions it needs. The membrane tier was more complicated. Membrane heals differently than bone, in stages, and the contamination I dealt with in the first days had left a section of tissue that was going to be problematic. I debrided it on the 16th day, which required more from him than anything else we had done, and he held still for all of it. Afterward, when I had cleaned my instruments and was sitting back on my heels, I put my hand flat on the uninjured part of the wing membrane, near the joint. It was warm. The scales there were smaller than on the body, more fine-grained, and they held the texture of worked leather, dense and slightly yielding under pressure. He turned his head and looked at me. I said, "You're doing well." His breath came out in a long, slow draft. He had moved over the weeks closer to the station until he was lying with his uninjured side against the east wall, which was the warmest wall in the afternoon, and which I had stopped thinking of as unusual sometime in the third week. I would step out in the morning and he would be there, the great scaled flank of him against the composite panels, the slow movement of his ribs visible with each breath, and the amber gold eyes would open when they heard my step. There were mornings when the light was right and the air was still and the reach was absolutely quiet, and I would stand outside the station door for a moment before going in for the kit, just standing in that light with the evidence of the previous day's work in front of me, and I would think about my wife. She had always said that the animals knew. She had come to the clinic in the early years and watched me work, and she had said, "They know, they can feel whether you mean it." And I had said, "Of course they can." And she had said, "You say of course, but most people don't actually believe it." I believed it. I had always believed it. It was, if I am honest about it, the organizing fact of the work, the thing everything else hung on. He knew. I mean that plainly. He knew. In the way that the injured creatures always know, whether you are there for them or there for yourself, whether you will stay or whether you are already calculating your exit. By the end of the third week, he did not watch me come across the perimeter in the braced way of the first days, the all-over readiness of a creature that is waiting for the situation to change against it. He watched me come across the perimeter the way I imagine he had watched the members of his own group come toward him, with recognition, with the ease of a known quantity. I was the person who came in the morning and came again at midday and came in the late afternoon, and I had done this every day without exception, and that fact had accumulated into something he could rest against. On the 14th day, the uplink had given me 2 hours, and I had filed my report. On the 28th day, it gave me 90 minutes, and I filed the status update. On the 35th day, it failed entirely and stayed failed, and I did not file anything for 11 days, which was the longest gap in my reporting record in 9 years of commission work. I was not troubled by this. The work did not require the uplink to proceed. Every piece of it was here, in front of me, in the patient's incremental progress, and that was the only reporting that actually mattered. We were 37 days into it when I noticed the others. I had been aware, in a peripheral way, that I was being watched. That is not easy to explain. When you spend enough time outdoors, in frontier terrain, working in a space that belongs to something other than yourself, you develop a sensitivity to the quality of the air, and the sound, and the light. That is not quite any of those things separately, but is all of them together. A kind of ambient reading of the environment that tells you when the environment has changed. I had felt it for several days. A heaviness in the eastern ridge. A quality of attention from beyond the perimeter that I could not pin down. On the 37th evening, sitting on the station step as the light went from the ridgeline, I saw them. 7 shapes on the high ridge, motionless, enormous. The failing light caught the edges of them the way it catches the edges of storm cloud, dark against the remaining sky, and they were at a distance that made precise detail impossible, but there was no ambiguity about what they were. They had been watching. I did not know how long. I finished my dinner and went inside. In the morning, they were at the perimeter. I stepped out of the station at first light, and they were there. 7 of them, ranged along the east perimeter fence in a line that said, "We have made a decision about where we are." They were not in the posture of curiosity. They were in the posture of purpose. I had no experience with this exact situation, and yet there was nothing ambiguous about the posture. The head carriages were high. The wings were half opened, not deployed, not raised to full threat position, but not folded either, held at an intermediate angle that was something between readiness and demonstration. Their scales were various. A deep iron red on the largest, a mottled dark green on 2 of them flanking the center, a pair of near black with gold patterning along the ridgeline of the back, and one, set slightly apart from the others, whose scales were the color of pale smoke, almost silver in the early light. I stood in the station doorway. They looked at me. The patient had lifted his head. From where I stood, I could see him through the window's corner angle. He had turned toward the arriving group, and his posture had changed, become tighter, more alert, but not, I thought, frightened. Something else. I did not have a word for it yet. I walked toward them. This, I am aware, is the part of the account that requires explanation. There are people who have heard this story. There will be more now, I expect, and whose first question is, how were you not afraid? The honest answer is that I was afraid. I was afraid in the way that I have been afraid before difficult procedures, which is a clear and specific fear with a task inside it. A fear that does not disable you, but that sharpens everything, makes every decision feel precisely weighted. I was afraid, and I was also the person who had been doing this work for 38 years, and who had spent 40 days with the patient behind me, and who knew, with a certainty I could not have explained to a tribunal, that whatever these 7 had come for, they had not come for nothing. I stopped 10 meters from the largest one, the iron red one. He was slightly forward of the others, which I took to mean something about hierarchy. His scales were a color like old blood that has dried to rust, and the ridgeline spines along his back were the black of hardened iron, and his eyes were a deep amber, darker than the patient's, the color of old whiskey in a glass. He was watching me with an absolute steadiness, the kind of stillness that is not inaction but its opposite. Everything gathered, nothing wasted. I said calmly, "Good morning." He regarded me for a long time. Then he spoke. The sound was deep, a sound that came from a chest cavity of extraordinary size, and the register of it was something I felt as much as heard, a low harmonic that moved through the ground and through my boots and up into my sternum. It was not words that I could parse, but the inflection was clear enough, a question, a demand more precisely, the kind of sound a very large and very serious entity makes when it wants to know what you have done with something that belongs to it. I said, "He came to my perimeter. He was badly hurt. I treated him. They could hear me." I understood that much from the quality of their attention. "Compound fracture of the left wing's leading edge structure," I said, "because when I am uncertain of the protocol, I default to the clinical, and the clinical has never yet failed me as a mode of communication. Secondary stress fracture at the first major joint. Significant membrane tear, lower third, with contamination that required debridement. Dehydration and blood loss on arrival. He's 40 days into recovery. The fracture is healing cleanly. The membrane I am less certain about. There is a section of tissue that may have permanent structural compromise, but flight should be possible. The wing will not be what it was. I said this steadily. The way you deliver a prognosis to the people who have been waiting for it. And I watched them receive it, and the quality of their reception told me things I could not have put into precise language, but that I read in the way you read the room when you have been delivering prognoses for a long time. A long silence from the line of them. The iron red one lowered his head just slightly. Not a bow. I want to be careful about using that word, because I do not know what the gesture means in their terms. I do not want to overlay my interpretation onto what they did. He lowered his head. The others were still. Then the patient spoke. The sound of it came from behind me, from the east side of the station where he had been lying, and it was the first sound of that kind I had heard from him in 40 days. It was not loud. Relative to his size, it was almost quiet, but it had a resonance that the iron red one clearly received, because the iron red one's posture changed at it. Something shifting in the carriage of his head and the set of his wings. The patient spoke for what I would estimate as several minutes, a long, sustained thing with a cadence that was unmistakably a recounting of something, and the others attended to it without moving. I stood still and waited. The patient's voice, when he chose to use it, was different from anything the others had produced in those first moments at the perimeter. It had a quality that I can only describe as deliberate precision, each sound placed with intention. The way a person speaks, when the thing they are saying matters enough that they want no part of it misheard. I could not follow the words, but I followed the shape of it, the arc, the places where the tone dropped to something almost private and then lifted again to something that had the quality of a public statement, a thing being said for the record. When the patient finished, the silence held for a while. Then the pale silver one stepped forward. She was smaller than the iron red by a third, but there was something about the way the others adjusted to her approach. A subtle rearrangement of the line, a small yielding that told me she occupied a position that was not about size. She came to within 4 meters of me, and she looked at me with eyes that were a clear pale gray, lighter than her scales. Steady and intelligent, and searching in a way that reminded me, obscurely, of a diagnostician. Someone doing triage by examination rather than instrument. She spoke. The sounds were different from what the iron red had produced. Slower, more structured. Not simpler, I do not want to imply simpler, more deliberate, as though something was being chosen carefully in the shaping of each sound. Then she said my name. Not the sound of my name as I would say it. A transliteration, the syllables reshaped in a vocal register that was not built for them, but recognizable. Kale. She said Kale. I had never told any of them my name. I had not told the patient my name. I had not in 40 days thought to, I said. Yes, that's right. She produced a sequence of sounds that I understood, somehow, not the words, but the intention inside them was a question about what I had expected in return for what I had done. I thought about it honestly. Nothing, I said. He needed help, that's all there was. Another sequence of sounds. The gray eyes held mine. This one felt more complex, a sequence inside a sequence. The way certain questions contain within them an acknowledgement of what the answer will be. Before it arrives, I said, he was in my care. I don't leave patients. I paused. He is still in my care, technically, until the membrane tissue gives me a clearer picture. Maybe another 2 weeks. The pale silver one turned and spoke to the iron red. Whatever she said, the iron red received it in a stillness that was different from the earlier stillness. Less demand in it, something else, something quieter. He looked at me for a long time, then he lowered his head fully. Not the partial gesture from before. His chin came to the ground, the great scaled head resting on the earth before me, the amber golden eyes looking up from that position. Not diminished, not defeated, but deliberate, chosen, the kind of gesture that a person makes when they want there to be no ambiguity about its meaning. The others followed, one by one, the line of them, wings folded now, heads to the ground. The patient behind me made a sound I had not heard from him before. It was softer than anything else he had produced. A deep, settled sound that had a quality I will call gratitude, because I do not have a better word. Though I am aware that I am a large animal vet from the northern hill country, and not a diplomat, and probably should apply that caveat to my translations. I looked at them all for a moment. I looked at the patient. I said, "He needs another 2 weeks of membrane observation minimum. I'd prefer 3. I want to see how the tissue responds before he attempts any loading of that wing." The pale silver one raised her head and regarded me with the gray eyes. "I am not finished," I said. "I don't walk away from a patient before the work is done." She produced one more sound, short, clean, with an inflection I read as understood. Then she produced a second sound, addressed to me, which she repeated twice, with a deliberateness that said, "This is for you to have. This is yours to take from this place." The sound was Keth Varen, 2 syllables and then 2 more. She said it a third time, clearly, and the Iron Red lifted his head from the ground and repeated it, and the others repeated it after him, down the line of them, each one saying it once, the sound moving through the group like a formal passage. I did not know what it meant. I learned later. I will tell you what it means at the end of this account, because that is the right order. Things should be understood in the order they were earned. The weeks that followed were different from the weeks before. The 7 did not leave. They remained in the reach, outside the perimeter, at distances that varied but were never out of sight of the station. I treated this as I would treat any change in a stable situation. I noted it in the log. I made no alteration to my routine, and I continued the work. The patient, I need to find another way to refer to him, and I will tell you his name when we get to the part of the account where the naming matters. The patient progressed well. The membrane tissue in the damaged section was not going to return to full integrity. I had been honest with the pale silver one about that. There would be a scar, a region of the membrane that would be less elastic and less responsive than the surrounding tissue, and the wing would compensate for it over time in the way that all injured structures compensate. The surrounding anatomy adjusting, redistributing load, building functional patterns around the limitation. He would fly. The quality of flight I could not predict. These were things I told him directly, sitting beside him in the late afternoon, because I tell all my patients the truth about their prognosis, even the ones who cannot confirm that they've understood it. He listened. He watched me with those pale amber gold eyes. The quality of his attention had not changed from the early weeks. It was still total, still particular, but it had acquired something additional. Not vigilance, not wariness. Something easier than that. Something that did not need me to explain what I was about to do before I did it, because by now he already knew. On the 54th day, I took the splint off. I had been checking the fracture by touch and by careful loading assessment for several days before that, building up a picture that was confident enough to act on. The morning I removed it was clear and still, the first real autumn cold in the air, and we worked slowly, him holding the wing in the extended position I needed while I disassembled the composite struts and freed the binding. When the last piece came away, I ran my hands along the former fracture line, feeling for the callus formation, the hard new knitting of tissue that meant the repair had taken. It had taken. I said, "Good." He made the soft sound again. The one from the morning the 7 had come. Then he did something I had not expected. He lowered his head to me, all the way to the ground, the same gesture the Iron Red had made, but slower, held for longer, and then he raised it and looked at me with an expression I will not try to translate because I am not qualified to translate it, only to receive it, which I did. I stepped back and he extended the wing fully. It was, I have seen many things in 38 years, and I have been moved by many of them. By the moment a bone that should not have healed heals, By the moment an animal that was going to be still for the rest of its life gets up and walks, by the particular quality of a creature's movement when it first believes again in its own capability. I have seen those moments many times. This was one of them, and it was also different from all of them, in the way that something unprecedented is different even when it rhymes with everything you know. He extended both wings. The left, the repaired one, went out more slowly, with a caution that was appropriate and that I hoped he would maintain for at least several more weeks. But it went out fully, the full span of it, and the membrane caught the morning light and held it in a way that made the thin scar tissue visible as a darker line running diagonally across the lower third, but not a ruinous line, not a line that said this is broken, a line that said this is healed. The 7 in the reach lifted their heads. There was a sound from all of them together, a harmonic chord of a sound that came from 8 chests and moved across the high ground and up the ridgeline and echoed back from the stone. And I stood in the middle of it and felt it in my sternum again, that low physical resonance. And I am not a man who wears his feelings on his face as a general rule, but I will admit that this cost me something. I stood in the echo of it, and I thought about the 43 days I had worked this posting before he arrived, and the 54 since. And I thought about the morning I had first crouched at the perimeter fence, and he had looked at me with those amber gold eyes, and not yet decided. And I thought about all the early mornings in between, the cold cart runs, the membrane paste diluted and rationed, the splint rebuilt twice, the days the uplink was down, and the days the cold came in hard from the north ridge and the membrane work had to be done faster to keep both of us out of the wind. I stood in the echo of that sound and I let it complete. After a while I said, don't load it heavily for at least 3 weeks. Use updrafts where you can. Let the tissue adapt to the loading before you push it. You know your body better than I do, but you should know what I'd tell any patient at this stage. He looked at me. And eat properly, I said. You're still underweight. The pale silver one had come to the perimeter line. She waited there until I walked to her. She spoke for a while. I cannot give you the full text of it because I did not understand the full text of it at the time, and I am reconstructing from what was later translated for me. What I understood in the moment was the shape of it, a formal shape, a shaped thing, not conversational in the way our exchanges had been conversational, something composed and presented. What I understood in the moment was that the patient had a name and a rank that I had not known, and that the rank was significant, that the 7 who had come to the perimeter had come expecting to find the evidence of a human who had taken advantage of his helplessness, because that was the thing that had been done before, in other frontier territories, and it was the thing they had prepared themselves to address, and that instead they had found 40 days of something else entirely, she said. He told us that every night he lay at your perimeter, he knew you could have finished it. There were nights when he was too weak to have prevented it. You never came in the night. You only came to work, I said. That was never a consideration. She was quiet for a moment. I mean that plainly. The hours of the dark were not the hours of the work, and the patient was in my care. And in my care means precisely that, not at my disposal, but in my charge, a responsibility that runs in one direction. The idea of it, coming in the night, when he was at his most vulnerable, when the compound fracture was fresh, and the dehydration deep, and the amber gold eyes were sometimes closed against something that had to be pain. The idea of it did not arrive in a form that required decision. It was simply not a thing. The same way that cruelty is not a thing you refuse so much as a thing that exists in a register your hands do not speak. I do not know how to explain this to someone who has not done the work. Perhaps I cannot. What I can say is that 38 years of this teaches you, if it teaches you anything, that the creature in front of you is not there to serve your purposes. It has arrived at a moment of vulnerability, and it is asking, in whatever language it has, for the specific kind of help that you specifically can provide. That is the whole transaction. You give what you can give. You do not take anything back from it. You come in the morning and you check the splint, and you give the water and you do. Not leave until the work is done. And when it is done, you come back again. And the work that accumulates in that pattern, the plainness of it, the dailiness of it, that is what the creature receives. Not a performance, not a gesture. Just the hours, day after day, adding up to something a patient can rest against. You do not need to announce it. The patient learns it from the simple fact of you appearing again each morning, kit in hand, ready to begin. That is the announcement. It requires nothing else. Then she said the word again, Keth Varen. And then she said it in full, the longer form of it that I had not heard before. A longer phrasing that the Iron Red confirmed from behind her with a single low sound of assent. The full form, which I had translated for me later by the Commission's Corthon Reach liaison officer, who spent 40 minutes on it and then sat back and said, "This is not a common designation, and I want to be careful with the translation. Keth Varen means, roughly, the one who kept the blade company while it could not lift itself. The Iron Red, whose name was Vareth. The patient's name was Vareth, their first blade, their highest war rank, the leading fighter of the Corthon First Reach, who had gone down in a border engagement 6 weeks before. I found him. The Iron Red was the captain of Vareth's personal guard. He had been looking for him for 37 days before they found the trail to my perimeter. He came to the perimeter line, and he looked at me for a long time. And then he said something brief and direct. And what the liaison officer later told me it meant was, "We came here to right a wrong. We found instead that there was none. That is a thing we will not forget," I said. "Take care of his wing." The captain, I did not know his name either, but I have since learned it is Sorath, looked at me the way that very large and very old things look at you when you have said something that lands. Unexpectedly, I said, "I'm serious. The membrane tissue will continue to remodel for the better part of a year. He should not be in heavy combat on that wing for a minimum of 6 months. I'd say 8 to be safe. But I know there's terrain to cover, and I'm not his commanding officer. I'm just the vet." A sound from the captain that the context told me was something like understood. Vareth came to the perimeter. He stood there looking at me, and his head came down one more time to the earth between us, and stayed there for a long time, and I put my hand on the side of his jaw, the scaled surface of it warm in the morning air, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say that the work hadn't already said. After a while he lifted his head. He looked at me one last time with those pale amber gold eyes, and I looked back, and there was an entire conversation in that, the kind that does not need words, because it is not made of words. It is made of 40 days and a badly set composite splint and 400 liters of water delivered by handcart and the hours of the early morning, when the membrane paste needed to be reapplied, and the hours of the late afternoon sitting in the long shadow of the east wall watching the ridge line go amber and violet together. Then he opened both wings, slowly, the left with that appropriate care, and he launched. It was not a graceful launch. The left wing's first downstroke was effortful, compensatory, visibly unequal to the right, but the second stroke was better. And by the time he had cleared the near ridge, he was using the thermal that ran along the rock face the way the Reach's raptors use it, and the asymmetry was less visible, and his line through the air was rising. The 7 followed him up. I watched until they were over the far ridge and gone. Then I went inside. I filed the case summary in the log. I noted the patient's departure, the status of the healing, the prognosis, the care instructions I had given, the recommended follow-up timeline. I noted the visit from the patient's associated group, the outcome of that encounter, and the designation conferred, which I spelled phonetically as best I could and flagged for the liaison office's attention. I made a cup of tea. I drank it on the south step. The ridgeline was early morning light, not the amber violet of the evenings, a clear gray gold that was a different kind of beautiful. The air was cold and still, and the Reach was empty. I thought about what the liaison officer had said about the designation, the one who kept the blade company while it could not lift itself. I had not known what Vareth was. I had known what he needed, which was the compound fracture reduced and the membrane cleaned and water and time and somebody who came back every day. The rest of it, the title, the rank, the 37 days of searching, none of that had been part of the equation. It could not have been, because I had not known it. And somehow that was the thing the pale silver one had wanted to convey, had worked hardest to make me understand, that I had done it without knowing, that the doing of it without knowing was precisely the thing. I thought about that for a while. Then I thought about the northeast corner of the boundary strip, and whether the wolf pack's denning signs from the early weeks had progressed into an active denning situation because the season was right for it, and I had not checked that corner in 10 days, and it was on the morning's list. I finished my tea, I put on my boots and my jacket, and I picked up my field kit, and I went to do the rounds. That is the account, most of it. There are things afterward that other people have told more completely than I can. The diplomatic weight of the designation, the significance of the Corthon First Reach's formal acknowledgement, the Commission's somewhat startled response to the case summary I filed, the 14 messages from the regional office in the 2 weeks after the liaison officer filed his supplementary report, the meeting I was asked to attend by video uplink, during which several officials asked me a series of questions that seemed, in retrospect, designed to establish whether I had been aware of Verith's identity and rank when I commenced treatment, to which my answer was the same each time. No, I had not been, and if I had been, I would have done exactly the same thing, because the fracture was compound and displaced, and the membrane was contaminated, and the patient was in front of me, and that was everything there was to know. I am a large animal vet, and these diplomatic and institutional matters are not my areas of expertise. What I can tell you is what I know from the work. Most animals, even the ones that arrive at you terrified or enraged, will accept your hands if you move slowly enough and mean what you're doing. The trick is to mean it. I have been doing this work for 38 years, and I have never once found a trick for faking that part. You mean it or you don't, and the patient knows. They always know. Verith knew. That is, I think, all there is to say. He needed a certain kind of help, and I gave it, day by day, and he received it, day by day, with a patience and a trust that I have tried to be worthy of, in the way I always try to be worthy of a patient's trust, which is to say, without drama, without sentiment, with just the work and the hours and the coming back. In the spring, the Commission relocated me to a coastal survey post, which was a different kind of frontier. The new posting had its own lists and its own mornings. And I was on those mornings what I have always been on mornings. A man with a field kit and a bad knee and enough experience to know that whatever is in front of you, the work itself will tell you what to do. In the spring, the Corthon Reach liaison office forwarded me a message. It was brief and had been translated by the same officer who had spent 40 minutes on Kethvaren. It said, "First Blade Verith resumed full flight operations in the 3rd month. The wing held. The scar tissue adapted well. He asked that this be conveyed to Kethvaren." I wrote back, "Good. Tell him to keep eating properly." I do not know if that message was delivered or how it was received at the other end. I expect it was received the way that all plain statements of professional concern are received when they come from somewhere unexpected, with something between bemusement and a kind of warmth that does not require elaboration. I packed my kit for the coastal post. There were 7 stops on the first day's route, 2 of them flag priority from the previous cycle. I noted them in order and started the truck and drove into the morning light. And I thought, as I sometimes do on the first day of a new route, about my wife and what she would have said about the ridgeline and about the dragons and about a 66-year-old man with a bad knee who keeps turning up in the places where the large and the damaged things are. She would have said, "You're not surprised, are you?" And the honest answer would have been, "No, not even slightly." That is probably the most truthful ending to this account that I can manage. My wife would have agreed with that assessment, I think. She was a practical woman, and she had little patience for embellishment. What happened is what happened. she would have said. Say it plainly and stop there. It's enough.